I want to ask you a question. What is empathy to you? Because to me, empathy is one of those values that nobody really questions. We teach it at schools, we teach it in the workplace, and in politics, it's almost always treated as a moral baseline for policy and legislation. If you're not empathetic, you are seen to be the problem. And I just want to be clear here. Empathy is important for us as humans. Being able to understand somebody else's situation, to see things from their perspective, that is a core part of being human. But something clicked for me recently. I was at my daughter's school assembly a couple of weeks ago, and the principal was giving a talk to the school children on empathy. She explained that when we help other people, our brains release a chemical called oxytocin. This chemical releases into our brain and makes us feel good when we do good for others. And of course, that stuck with me because it made me start wondering, if we act out of empathy, how much of that is actually through the desire to truly help others? And how much of it is about how it makes us feel good? And of course, once you start thinking about it in that light, you start to see a pattern and potentially a problem. Because across a lot of Western countries right now, there are ongoing debates about things like immigration, welfare, housing, and of course, public spending. And these debates are usually framed in a very simple way. One side is compassionate and the other side is selfish. But I think that this framing misses something really important because empathy works very differently depending on the scale it's applied to. I'll tell you what I mean. If you look at the people who support more generous systems, whether it's immigration policy or welfare expansion, their argument's usually grounded in something that sounds pretty reasonable to the average person. They believe that wealthy societies have a responsibility to help people who are struggling. They see restrictive systems as unnecessarily harsh, and of course, they view social programs as a way to protect people from falling through the cracks. And historically, empathy has driven a lot of positive change. We've seen the civil rights movement, worker protections, disability access, plenty of other examples. Now, these things didn't come from nowhere, of course. They came from people recognizing suffering, and they decided it mattered. So the instinct itself isn't the issue. But there are some other problems with this overarching sense of empathy being applied to a society as a whole. And it's less about the intention, and it's more about what happens when those intentions are scaled up into these larger societal systems. Because policy doesn't just help one person, it creates incentives for many. If you expand access to benefits, more people will try to access them. If you relax entry requirements, more people will come. If enforcement is weak, people will constantly push and test those boundaries. And over time, the pressures build. You start to see a strain in available housing, pressure on public services such as hospitals, transport, etc. And of course, ever-increasing taxes to sustain the growing demand. And these costs, we all know they don't fall evenly. They tend to land on the very large section of the middle class of society. But there's also another layer to this that I do think is worth talking about. Because empathy hasn't just shaped modern policy debates. You could argue that it played a huge role in building Western society as we know them as a whole. Movements against things such as the global slave trade, cruel and unusual punishments such as torture and public executions, and of course, as I mentioned before, the lack of worker protections. A lot of that came from people expanding their sense of empathy beyond the immediate group that they co-inhabited with. At some point, people started saying, just because something's normal and happens every day, this does not mean it's right. And that does matter because it suggests empathy, when applied carefully, can drive real moral progress for a society as it grows. But I think where things get just that little bit more complicated is what happens when that same instinct keeps expanding exponentially. Because at some point, empathy stops being about reforming your own system and starts becoming about trying to take responsibility for problems at a much larger global scale. And that's where the trade-offs start to get a bit messy. Take something like helping developing countries. On the surface, the intention to help them is pretty straightforward. You see poverty, instability, or lack of opportunity, and the instinct is to help them. That might mean foreign aid, accepting migrants, or funding international programs to help the people. The intention is, of course, understandable and honourable, in my opinion. But, of course, the outcomes aren't always as straightforward as the intention. Because when you help scale across entire systems, you start creating incentives for people, and not everyone, as we know, has good intentions. For example, large amounts of aid can prop up governments that are not accountable to their own people. We see this all throughout Africa and some parts of the Middle East. External support can sometimes reduce pressure for internal reform amongst the people and governments. Why would you do financial and societal reform when people just keep giving you bucket loads of money? And migration, of course, can relieve pressure in the short term, but it just shifts problems long term to other countries rather than solving the root cause of the issue. So instead of solving these underlying problems, you just end up displacing them to other places or prolonging them altogether. And this is where empathy becomes just a little bit more complicated, because helping feels good. It gives you a sense that you're doing the right thing. But feeling like you're helping and actually improving a situation long term, these are not always the same thing. And I think this is where modern Western societies are in a bit of a difficult situation, because the same instinct that helped build more humane systems internally doesn't necessarily translate cleanly when applied externally at a global scale, especially to other cultures who think and act very differently than we do in Western societies. And this is where I think a useful idea comes in. At a large scale, empathy gets broken. For most of human history until the last few thousand years, you lived in a very small community of maybe 100 or so people. If someone was struggling, helping them, of course, made sense. You knew them, you saw the impact directly, and supporting them strengthened the group as a whole. Empathy worked incredibly well in that environment. But modern societies are not small groups anymore. They are massive, complex systems. Millions, if not billions of people, global movements, layered bureaucracies, and no one-size-fits-all policy or legislation to apply to them. And at that scale, decisions that feel compassionate in individual cases can produce very different outcomes when applied broadly. Helping one person feels good, designing a system that helps millions or billions without breaking, that is much harder. And further to that, empathy doesn't just benefit the person receiving help. As I mentioned earlier, it rewards the person giving it, the oxytocin effect. You feel like a good person. Again, not a bad thing, and it is a reward system from our brain to make us want to help others and contribute to growing and helping our group as a whole. But it does mean that empathy, of course, can become self-read, because now you add social media on top of all of this. And suddenly, empathy isn't something you feel, it's something you can display. You can signal what you care about. You can show that you are on the right side of an issue. And with that comes rewards. Approval, validation, and of course, a sense of identity and belonging. So you end up in this feedback loop where expressing empathy publicly becomes part of how people now define themselves. And sometimes the focus shifts away from whether a policy actually works to whether it feels morally right to support it. So the takeaway for me, of course, that empathy isn't bad, is that the empathy on its own is not enough. Good policy needs three things: compassion, incentives, and it has to be sustainable. If you remove one of those things, the system starts to drift. Too little compassion, things become harsh. Too little attention to incentives, and systems, of course, get exploited and overloaded. Too little focus on sustainability, and everything else looks fine until it all falls apart. And I think one of the challenges right now is that empathy has become so central to how we talk about these issues that questioning the outcome sounds like questioning the intention behind it. If you criticize a policy, it gets interpreted as a lack of compassion. But these are not the same thing. You can care about people and still ask whether the system designed to help them is actually working long-term for them. So when I think back to that school assembly, I don't disagree with the message, especially for children. Empathy is important. It does matter. But like most things, it has limits. What works at the level of individuals doesn't always scale cleanly to the level of societies. And if you ignore that, you can end up with systems driven more by how helping others feels than by whether it actually works at all. And that to me is the tension and the question behind this. How do you stay compassionate without losing the ability to think clearly about trade-offs? Because if you get that balance right, you get a society that's both humane and stable. But if you get it wrong, you risk ending up with something that feels good in the moment, but doesn't hold up over time. Good intentions, of course, do matter, but positive outcomes matter even more. Bye for now.